I want to thank St. Edward's University for holding this symposium. In particular, I want to thank Professor Innes Mitchell and Dr. James Puglisi for being so helpful in allowing this to take place. I also want to thank you all for being here to be open to learning about this difficult topic. And certainly, as was said earlier, I'm available to talk to folks after this if you'd like to speak to me, and I'll put my email address at the end of this talk, so you can contact me that way as well. I'd like to start with this question. Can religion be bad for kids? Or more to the point, can religious belief lead adults to abuse and neglect children? Some people feel that religion has nothing to do with harming children. Rather, as I've been told by some, perpetrators of abuse and neglect are just sick, sadistic individuals who may not understand how to interpret doctrine correctly. They're right to a point. There are cases where perpetrators would commit crimes against children regardless of their beliefs. In fact, many of these individuals will act in tandem, which leads some to question really whether mental illness is even part of it. I've looked at many criminal cases and studies and so forth, and most of the cases I've run across, the individuals are not mentally ill. They're not sick, they're not sadistic. A lot of what we're going to be learning about tonight is not about people necessarily acting out of cruelty, but acting out of what they believe makes a pious individual. Before going further, I want to make clear that a majority of people of faith don't abuse and neglect kids. And many certainly don't justify abuse and neglect with faith. While the headlines can lead us to think the worst, the vast majority of clergy do not molest children. In fact, many faith communities throughout the country are doing amazing things to help kids who are abused and neglected and to prevent those cases from happening. While Pope Francis has been somewhat criticized for lack of action in the past, he has done something that's unprecedented. He has started a panel that includes women and a survivor to take a serious look at the issue of child sexual abuse in the church. But sadly, we must also acknowledge that there are too many children being harmed in the name of faith. According to Marcy Hamilton, who's a law professor at Yeshiva University, the United States has a romantic attitude toward religious individuals, as though they're always doing what is right. But the unrealistic belief that religion is always for the good is a hazardous myth. Horrible things have been done to children beneath the cloak of religion. Children have been raped, beaten, and permitted to die excruciating deaths. Here are some examples of what Professor Hamilton is talking about. Earlier this year, Herbert and Catherine Scheibel of Pennsylvania were sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years in prison in the death of their child. 8-month-old Brandon died of pneumonia, and rather than get him to the doctor or hospital, the Scheibels simply prayed for him. The couple belongs to a Pentecostal Christian church that believes in faith healing over medicine. Remarkably, this isn't the first time this couple has been convicted in the death of one of their children. In 2009, they were convicted in the death of their 2-year-old son, Kent, who, like Brandon, died of pneumonia, a treatable illness, after the couple treated him with prayer. In 2008, more than 400 children in the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the FLDS sect, were removed from their homes because the polygamous group was found to be spiritually marrying underage girls to older men. What followed was the largest U.S. custody case in U.S. history. Largest child custody case in U.S. history. The group believed in underage marriage and justified this practice with Mormon-based doctrines. In the end, 11 men were imprisoned on child sexual abuse charges, including Warren Jeffs, the sect's leader. He was found to have raped a 12-year-old girl in the temple while 2 women presided. For many years, we've seen outbreaks of diseases in religious communities due to members refusing to vaccinate their children. This not only leaves their own members vulnerable to life-threatening disease, but the wider community as well. Often the refusal to vaccinate is tied to a group's belief that outsiders, especially governmental agencies, are evil. This map shows outbreaks of measles in 2013. Measles is a disease that can cause pneumonia, deafness, and death. It's highly contagious and has no cure. The red circles mark outbreaks at religious communities and schools, the largest being a conservative Jewish community in Brooklyn, New York, in which 58 people got measles. About a month ago, a couple in Wisconsin who belonged to the Aletheia Bible Church were convicted on child abuse charges. They were the last of a handful of parents to be found guilty of harming their children through excessive corporal punishment. The church was led by this man, Philip Caminiti, who was sentenced to 2 years in prison for conspiracy to commit child abuse after he instructed congregants to punish children as young as infants and toddlers by striking them on the bare buttocks with wooden dowels based on his interpretation of the Bible. Such punishments, used on children as young as 6 weeks old, were administered for such, quote, selfish acts as being grumpy, crying, or making noise in church. Finally, you may not be familiar with the Jewish ritual known as Metzitzah B'Peh. The ritual, which occurs after circumcision, involves a mohel putting his mouth on the baby's penis and sucking blood from the wound. Today, ultra-Orthodox communities still perform Metzitzah B'Peh. Tragically, some babies have contracted herpes simplex 1 as a result, a disease that a vast majority of Americans have. When newborns contract herpes, it can cause brain damage and even death. Since 2000, there have been 14 reports of babies having contracted herpes after undergoing this ritual in New York City alone. Of those, 2 babies died. These are extreme cases, but I can assure you that I've uncovered ones that are even worse. And while it's difficult to get a handle on just how many children are at risk for religious child maltreatment, I think it's safe to say that there are many, many less egregious cases that don't make headlines, and so we never hear about them. How can we begin to understand what's going on here? Well, let's start by covering a few basic definitions. Maltreatment is abuse or neglect. Abuse being an action that leads to or has the potential to lead to harming a child, such as placing a child in a dangerous situation. Neglect is a failure to act when such failure poses harm to a child. There are many risk factors for child maltreatment. Based on my research, I believe it's important to add to this list of risk factors religious and other ideological beliefs. So, what is religious child maltreatment? It's child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators, victims, or the surrounding community. I'm going to repeat that. Religious child maltreatment is child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators, victims, or the surrounding community. Examples of abusive practices include physical or ritual abuse due to beliefs about, say, sinfulness in children, or legalistic interpretations of the Bible and using what is often known as the rod that is discussed in Proverbs. The Aletheia Bible Church is an example of that, and studies, in fact, show that conservative Christians tend to use corporal punishment a great deal based on their beliefs about ridding children of sin. You've probably heard that expression, beating the devil out of him, which is a similar concept. While corporal punishment isn't necessarily classified as physical abuse, most physical abuse starts out as physical punishment. Using one's religious status to overpower victims and procure their silence. We've read many cases in which religious leaders have done this to get victims to comply with sexual demands. Such manipulation can also happen in the home, where a parent might say to a victim, you need to honor your mother and father in all things, as it says in the Bible. Also, interfering with child development through religious indoctrination and isolation is a form of what social workers might consider to be exploiting, a form of emotional abuse, and we'll learn more about that a little bit later, especially when Carla speaks. Spurning or terrorizing, using religious messages. So, for example, telling a child that Jesus doesn't love you or you're going to go to hell. And sorry, that was the category that Carla is going to speak about. And I wanted to mention that this morning I received a comment to one of my blogs that spoke to this kind of form of maltreatment. A woman named Amber wrote, "A familiar statement I often heard in my youth was, 'You better have your heart right with the Lord. You never know when Jesus is coming back.' That statement scared the out of me. How do you know if your heart is right with the Lord? If I can't communicate with Him or see Him, how do I know if I was all good? I don't believe a young mind can truly comprehend faith. I don't know if I understand it now." Either way, this statement created a sense of inadequacy, confusion, but ultimately fear. I felt as though every person I loved was saved but me, so I tried very hard to please God. Examples of neglectful practices include failing to provide affection or comfort due to beliefs about the need for suffering and the, quote, sin of pride. Shunning or excommunicating a child, usually that would be an older child, like a teenager, for being disobedient. Failing to provide needed medical care due to beliefs about divine intervention and the power of faith healing. Failing to report abuse to protect the image of a religion, faith leader, or religious community. While the Catholic Church has received a lot of criticism for failing to report abuse, I don't think I've run across one religious organization that has consistently done a good job at reporting abuse to outside authorities. And it's not just religious leaders who feel the need to protect the image of their faith. Many congregants are on board with this idea as well. Many religious organizations have doctrines that pertain to avoiding scandal. And so you have faith leaders and others coming up with all sorts of ways to avoid reporting, including having their own internal trial system, if you will, and investigative teams, people that aren't trained in areas of crime investigation. The problems are that they often result in, when professionals do eventually arrive on the scene and investigate a case, they have a really hard time doing it well because evidence is been lost, people's memories fade, and that kind of thing. In the end, victims don't get help and perpetrators are not held accountable. I want to read a comment, a quote from an article written by Boz Tchividjian. He's the grandson of Billy Graham, and he runs an organization called Grace, which investigates abuse in churches. And this just appeared in a magazine. The heartbreaking reality is that the marginalization of survivors is all too common in the Christian community. I have encountered many abuse survivors who want nothing to do with Jesus because of being marginalized by the very community they had hoped would care most, the church. Just like the priest and Levi in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we are often so quick to embrace rational excuses for why we walk away. When we do this, we marginalize the very lives that God sees as beautiful and infinitely valuable. When we do this, we marginalize Jesus. Which children are at the greatest risk for religious child maltreatment? Are there certain religions that are worse than others? From my research, it actually doesn't matter whether the religion is Christianity or Islam or Judaism, or what kind of religious texts the family might be reading from, or whether they call a deity Jehovah or God or Allah. What it really comes down to is how a community is governed. What I mean by that is, when a child is being raised in a religious authoritarian culture, whether it's a church, a large religious organization, or a single household, kids are at a heightened risk for religious maltreatment. Religious authoritarian cultures share three main characteristics. They maintain a strict social hierarchy, so clergy would normally have a lot more power than everybody else. Men almost always have much more power than women, and children have next to no rights whatsoever. The membership is unusually fearful. And the culture is socially separatist. And social isolation is a big contributor to the problem, even if the group lives in an urban area. Just how does religious authoritarianism affect children? In these cultures, children are extremely vulnerable. And the reason is because they cannot rely on their parents, their chief caretakers, for protection. Let me explain what I mean. As I said before, harm comes from how communities, families in particular, are governed. In authoritarian systems, it's not family cohesion that is paramount, but family obedience. When one or more family members doesn't follow the rules, and there are often many, many rules to follow, they can be punished. For example, they can be shunned or excommunicated. This is a big fear because for many family members, leaving such a community, often one that's quite isolated, it would mean leaving behind their entire social network, and even believing that they'll have no chance at eternal salvation. And so you see families living in fear. You see scapegoating, parents severely punishing their children. In more totalitarian systems, you see children turning on their parents and even reporting them to the leadership. The bottom line here is that family bonds in these cultures are not strengthened, they're weakened. This is not a new phenomenon. I'm no theologian, but according to the New Testament, Jesus seemed to see the breakup of the family as a necessary price to pay if family members didn't believe in his truth. In Matthew 10, Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." I'll give you a more recent example. You may be familiar with the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas. They're the ones who protest soldiers' funerals, and they're expressing their anger at America's acceptance of homosexuality. I've been in touch with a young woman named Lauren Drain who was brought into the faith as a teenager, and her father found out that she was dating a man online and kicked her out of the household. Not only that, the church voted to excommunicate her from the community. When interviewed in a documentary, Lauren's father justified his actions by quoting from Matthew 10 and even referred to his daughter as an enemy of his household. While that sounds pretty cold, parents in religious authoritarian cultures are often victims themselves. That's because they're expected to raise their kids according to the rules of the culture instead of relying on their own instincts. This often involves adopting a one-size-fits-all parenting approach rather than taking into account children's individual needs. In this way, parents are frequently torn between their instinctual desire to protect their children and their desire to do what they believe pleases God. Take the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son. Fortunately, an angel sent by God tells Abraham he doesn't have to go through with it because God understands that Abraham fears him. Theologians say this story is important because it marks a time when cultures stop practicing child sacrifice. But I'm going to use this story to point out something else, and that is just what it must have been like for Abraham to make the call. Does he kill his own offspring or protect his son and thereby say no to God? It's an agonizing decision for a parent to make. So again, the parent in a religious authoritarian culture is torn between doing what he or she feels naturally is best for the child while being pulled in another direction, which involves harming the child as a way to prove the parent's allegiance to faith. And sadly, members of these cultures are not sent an angel to tell them to adopt a different parenting approach. One reason why we see some of these problems is because some people of faith worry that if they were to change their child-rearing practices, it would mean giving up their religious freedoms. And some take this so far that they essentially sacrifice the rights of children. For example, some religious organizations have claimed that clergy should not report abuse or release records of pedophiles because that would violate the First Amendment of the Constitution. Sometimes the law Courts or policymakers have had to step in to protect a child from harm and even death. For example, every state and the federal government has made it illegal to perform genital cutting on girls, also known as female circumcision, even though this ritual is very important to some religious and cultural groups. Courts have taken temporary custody of children to allow them to get life-saving blood transfusions because their parents are Jehovah's Witnesses who worry that if they receive a blood transfusion, it jeopardizes their chance at eternal salvation. Very often, however, courts and the law side with children's pious caretakers. When they do that, I believe they're setting up an uneven playing field where certain children who are being raised by the ultra-pious are denied the same rights as those children who are being raised in mainstream cultures. For example, in 1972, the Supreme Court decided that the Amish could take their children out of school at the age of 14, even though the state of Wisconsin, where the case was filed, mandated that education was required up until the age of 16. The court made this decision after hearing lawyers for the Amish argue that, quote, salvation requires life in a church community separate and apart from the world and worldly influence. I'm guessing the justices didn't know that the Amish, especially conservative Amish, have committed horrific abuses against children, including incest, physical abuse, and emotional terrorizing. Currently, the state of Idaho is debating whether to get rid of a religious exemption that allows parents to not be prosecuted for withholding medical care on religious grounds. Actually, dozens of states have a similar exemption. There's a large religious group in Idaho called the Followers of Christ that have graveyards full of dead children who died of treatable illnesses. To give just one example, a 15-year-old girl who got food poisoning and was not treated vomited over such a prolonged period of time, she died of a ruptured esophagus. And still, lawmakers in Idaho are quite candid that they oppose removing the exemption. To give you an idea of how far some people will go to protect what they believe are their religious liberties, consider what one public figure said in 1990. T. Gerald Witt, who was the mayor of Lake City, Florida, was incensed that his constituents expressed concern about a zealous faith-healing group called the End Times Ministry, who wanted to move to Lake City. Residents were so concerned about this group because they had heard that a baby had died from an untreated nosebleed. When he was interviewed on this issue, Mayor Witt told the St. Petersburg Times, "It's maybe necessary for some babies to die to maintain our religious freedoms. It may be the price we have to pay. Everything has a price." Mayor Witt was most likely unaware of a Supreme Court decision that was made in 1944, which the court said, "The right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community or the child to ill health or death. Parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow that they are free to make martyrs of their children before they have reached the age of full and legal discretion when they can make that choice for themselves." So what kind of solutions are available to us to try to eradicate religious child maltreatment? Let's start with what we can do legislatively or with policy. I believe that all clergy should be mandated reporters, and there are a number of states that do require that. There are a number of states that exempt clergy from being mandatory reporters. Some states have a loophole where if a member of the clergy hears about an abuse case in confession, he does not have to report it. I believe we should repeal religious exemptions like the one being debated in Idaho. I think it would be helpful to have new protocols for investigating uncooperative religious communities. So for example, with that custody case I was telling you about among the FLDS, where more than 400 kids were removed, the CPS was quite hampered by allowing the mothers to go with the kids when they were being questioned. And as a result of that, Texas changed their policy that said social workers can remove parents from the room. It ended up hampering the case severely to have the mothers there because they were telling the children basically not to answer any questions or make up lies about the sect. And then finally, I think it would be important to have every victim to be allowed a window of opportunity where they could come forward and sue a religious organization, even if it's just for a limited period of time. That has been really helpful with a lot of victims just finding closure in states that have allowed them to do that. I see faith communities as really taking the lead on this issue. There are required policies and procedures by insurance companies that a lot of religious communities have taken up. Many faith communities are very adamant that they need to prevent abuse. But I think that more can be done so that there's better response to cases when they do arise. We're still seeing problems where there's opposition to reporting abuse. I just read that bishops in Italy have stated now officially that they are not legally required to report abuse, which is true. It's not mandatory by law in Italy, but again, I just think that we need to kind of shift things a little bit and see the importance of if victims are comfortable with it, that they report abuse, and not just to a religious authority, to a secular authority. I think it would be important for faith communities to do more partnering with governmental agencies like Child Protective Services and law enforcement so they can learn more about the law. And as Carla mentioned, she and I are both on the board of the Child Friendly Faith Project. We're a nonprofit organization that works with faith communities to educate them about some of these things. And some of the things we're talking to faith communities about is, well, take a look at what kind of programs you have for children. How are you teaching them about the faith? And also, what kinds of things are you teaching parents about parenting? I'm going to skim through this one pretty quickly, but I think it's also important for governmental agencies to get more familiar with what's going on in faith communities, get to understand their traditions better, do their homework before they go in and investigate, and also form an ongoing partnership with faith communities so that when there is a case of abuse that arises, there's trust there so that the faith leaders or congregants won't feel so hesitant to pick up the phone and report it. I'm going to skip through to the next slide here. Maybe, though, what all this really comes down to is just acknowledging that children have basic human rights, the rights for needed medical care, for a proper education, and to feel and be safe. Maybe we should be asking questions such as, should children be indoctrinated into a belief system and denied access to mainstream information, as is typical in very conservative communities? Should adults be permitted to engage children in religious protests, issues they don't fully understand? Aren't these examples of exploiting a form of emotional abuse? When it comes to teaching children about faith, maybe we should question some religious stories that we were raised with that may not be appropriate for children. Maybe we should take more time to think about the sons and daughters who appear in those stories. Going back to the story of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham's agreement to sacrifice his son is typically viewed as a testament to his devotion to God. But what if we saw it from Isaac's viewpoint? For instance, we might ask, how did Isaac feel watching his beloved father tying him up and putting him on the woodpile? What were his thoughts when his father reached for the knife? It's interesting, in Rembrandt's depiction of the story, Abraham is covering his son's face. Why would he do that? Was it to spare him the sight of seeing his father kill him, or to silence him? After the incident was over, how might it have affected Isaac? Could he have suffered from PTSD? How might it have affected his family? Maybe we should take more time to think about how we perceive society's youngest members. Certainly, there is much scripture that supports the idea that children are important individuals. For example, in the New Testament, Jesus never advocates using corporal punishment on children. And in Matthew 18, he tells his followers to emulate children in their humility. Isaiah 11:6 paints the picture of a peaceful society and envisions children being front and center. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with a goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child shall lead them. Here's my contact information. By just learning and talking about the issue of religious child maltreatment, we can better ensure that a spiritual upbringing is a nurturing experience for every child. Thank you.